Greetings, students. I'm happy to say that we are now going to get into some deep philosophical content here, right? So you should have read Plato's Apology before looking at this lecture, right? So I'm going to assume that you've read it and I'm going to refer to it here and there. So that's what we're focused on, Plato's Apology. It's one of the first three dialogues we're going to read. Okay, so you're supposed to read the Apology, then the Crito, then the Euthyphro. These first three dialogues, we call them Socratic dialogues. So they're written by Plato, as you know, but the focus is on Socrates. He's the main character, and unlike what we see in the Republic and in the Phaedo, and we will read some snippets from those works, unlike what we see there, we think the real historical Socrates is being represented in these first three dialogues that we're going to look at, right? And this is especially true of the Apology. And the reason is, since you read the Apology, right, you know that Plato is trying to memorialize Socrates, right? That's how it looks, like he's trying to pay tribute to him. And so then we think, okay, well, this was written shortly after Socrates' actual trial, right? And then it would make sense for Plato to try to accurately represent that trial. I'm sure there was some poetic license. Specifically, we're pretty sure that the defendant, once found guilty and sentenced, wasn't really allowed to give a speech. But in the text, Socrates does. He speaks to his friends and he warns his enemies after he's already been sentenced to death. So that's just one little place where we think, okay, well, that probably didn't happen, but it wouldn't really make sense for Plato to memorialize Socrates by just making up a bunch of stuff, right? So we think Socrates mostly actually said these things that are in the Apology. That's not really true necessarily of the Euthyphro. Opinions are mixed there. But the spirit of the argumentation, the way that Socrates argues and approaches problems, that we think is really his, right? And it shifts in the later Platonic dialogues. After book one of the Republic, Socrates starts sounding very theoretical and metaphysical, which is unlike him. That's not how he seems in the Apology or the Euthyphro. He seems very skeptical and very, somewhat narrowly focused on specific problems in these early texts, right? So we think Plato is using Socrates as a mouthpiece in later dialogues, but this definitely, the Apology is one of the early ones. And so then we think that texts that are similar to the Apology are also early, and there's interesting textual evidence. You can run the texts through a computer and try to figure out, okay, which texts have similar word choices in them, and then a sort of pattern emerges, like these texts get lumped together, and here's some other texts that get lumped together, and you get a sort of timeline by doing that sort of process, right? And the Apology and the Crito and the Euthyphro really do lump together, right? And so it seems like young Plato wrote in a certain way, and his writing changed over time, and we can use that to date the texts. Okay, that's enough of an introduction here. Okay, so I wanted to put these dates up. Obviously, I've already mentioned Socrates and Plato, but I want to put their dates up side by side here. So we've got Socrates from 469 to 399 BCE. So 399 is when he was executed, right? And then Plato lived from 427 to 347 BCE. So Plato lived to be 80, as far as we know, right? We think these dates are correct, roughly speaking. I just wanted to point out that Plato was young when Socrates was executed, right? And it is remarkable that Plato kept writing about Socrates throughout his life. He kept putting him in dialogues. Maybe he put some words in his mouth later on in his career, right? But it's remarkable. So Socrates left quite an impression on him, and it's partly because of the age difference, I would think, right? So Plato is in his 20s, and he obviously thinks Socrates is very wise. You can tell from reading the Apology that that's what he thinks. He's following the guy around, probably trying to learn from him, even though Socrates says, I don't have any students, right? And and then Athens executed Socrates. So that's going to leave a mark, right? I mean, that would really make an impression on Plato. He did not get over it, we could say. Okay. And then there's some points about their different family lines here. So Socrates is the son of a stonemason and of a midwife. Her name was Phanerete. And Socrates tends to draw metaphors from this heritage. So he actually mentions his father in the Euthyphro. He mentions that he's descended from Daedalus, which means he sculpts things. He shapes stone, right? And so, like his father, he shapes minds, but he tends to mention his mother more than his father and say that he's like a midwife. He helps to give birth to truth. He helps other people to give birth to their ideas, right? So that's interesting, but also notice that Socrates is working class, right? His parents were in the trades, we could say, right? They were working class people, and that matters to the events in the Apology. Plato is in an aristocratic family, right? So he's supposedly descended from Athens' last king on his father's side, and then through his mother, he's related to Solon, who was a very important democratic reformer in Athens. He instituted jury pay, right? So if you were a poor farmer, you might have trouble participating in juries, but it's important in a democracy that people participate, right? So one of Solon's reforms was to institute pay for jury duty, okay? So Plato's from these old established families with money, and Socrates is from the working class, and yet people like Plato followed Socrates around. That's a problem for Socrates, right? There's at least an informal education system in Athens. There's not a university. Plato himself invented the first university, we say, right? He created the academy, we call it. So there wasn't a formal schooling system, and yet, as we'll see, the wealthy hired Sophists to teach their young men, and especially to teach them how to speak well, right? And here's Socrates, who doesn't speak well, and he mentions that, right? And he says, well, excuse me if I just talk in my normal way that I'm used to talking in the marketplace and elsewhere, right? He says that in the Apology. So he's good at argumentation, but he doesn't come off as very eloquent. He's constantly making metaphors that involve farm animals, and there's nothing wrong with that. It shows his background, right, which is not aristocratic. So, I mean, obviously, it bothered the Athenians that their young aristocratic men were following around this working class guy who spoke in a working class way, even if he was very good at argumentation. Okay. So we need some information about the history of philosophy here to understand what's happening in the Apology. Okay. So there are these early accusations, which we'll mention more emphatically, and we'll sort of focus on them later. But basically, Socrates studies things in the sky and below the earth, and he makes the weak argument the stronger. He gets accused of these things, not officially. That's not what's in the official affidavit. These are early accusations. They're sort of slander that Socrates thinks he needs to deal with. He thinks the official charges have been filed against him because of the slander that's been going around for years and years. So he tries to address the slander first. Okay, so this slide about some of the Presocratics is supposed to explain why Socrates was said to study things in the sky and below the earth. Where did that idea come from? Well, there were a lot of Presocratic philosophers who studied cosmology, and they studied the nature of the universe and what the universe was made of, right? And that's something like studying things in the sky and below the earth. So let's look at these Milesians here. These are just some of the Presocratics. The Milesian school is particularly interesting, partly because they started it all, right? So Thales here, the first Milesian, he's the first philosopher, we say. I mean, who really knows? But as far as recorded history goes, and certainly in the Western world, here's the first philosopher. Okay, and all of these philosophers on this slide are from Miletus. That's why this is the Milesian school. Miletus is a coastal city. It's in Ionia, the Greeks called it. That's Turkey today, right? So that's where the country of Turkey is located. And then this would be on the west coast, specifically, right? There's no east coast, but there's a southern and northern coast. So this is the west coast we're talking about. The Greeks spread out through the Mediterranean, right? So you kind of have to picture the Mediterranean in your head, right? And here's Greece, and here's Italy, and they're going that way to Italy, and they're going that way to Ionia, what we now call Turkey, and they're colonizing the coast, right? So Miletus is one of the coastal cities set up by Greek colonists, okay? And it's not coincidental, I would say, that the first recorded philosophical activity in the Western world took place in a coastal city. Why do I say that? Well, in a coastal city, people from different language groups and different ethnicities and different areas of the world are intermingling. They're going in and out of the harbor, and they're exchanging ideas, and they're finding really interesting disagreements with each other, right? Especially about religious stuff. And so that gets you thinking, right? All these disagreements. Why do we disagree so much? right? And you try to figure it out, and you try to figure out, well, what could be true that could account for the different ways that we're looking at things, right? And so it seems to me, yeah, you would expect, if you had an expectation about it at all, you would expect philosophy to come out of some kind of cosmopolitan area, right? A coastal city would be a great candidate, and historically, that's what happened. Okay, so Thales, we're not sure about his dates, obviously. He lived from 624 maybe to 546 maybe. This is, of course, BCE, before the Common Era. So, 200-ish, 150-ish years before Socrates. He held that everything is water and comes from the water, and that's kind of all we know about him. We don't have any of his writings, so that's what's interesting about him. That he had a theory about the universe and what it's made of and why it's a single universe, right? What's kind of holding it together. That's what's interesting about him, right? And he happened to pick water probably because, living things tend to have water in them. And so he figured life emerged from the water. Seems to have been right about that, at least, right? I could imagine him looking out at the coast, at the beach, and seeing how the land slopes down into the water, and so he kind of ran that backwards and imagined, oh, once there was just water and things started coming up out of the water, not just living things, but earth, the land, right? So everything is water. Originally, there was nothing but water, and things emerged from the water, but underneath the different appearances, everything still is water in some sense. That's what's holding it all together. Okay, I mean, that, it's an attempt. I like it. It's an interesting try. His student Anaximander lived from 611 to 547 BCE. He held that everything is the apeiron and comes from the apeiron. That word, you could translate it. I've just left it as the Greek term apeiron. It's a little tricky to translate. So it could mean the infinite, it could mean the indefinite, it could mean the unbounded. All of those words suggest that the apeiron is a little difficult to get a grip on, right? Which is exactly the right idea. What Anaximander is saying is, whatever the ultimate substance is that everything is made of, it's nothing definite that we could actually point at, right? So I've got this point of interest on the slide. The apeiron doesn't appear as itself, but it appears as other things, right? Water is too specific. That must have been part of what Anaximander was thinking. I mean, the Greeks thought specifically that fire is an element, and so Thales' view entails that fire is made of water. Now, of course, we know fire and water don't get along very well, so Anaximander, not just for that reason, but for other reasons, says, okay, well, whatever the basic substance is, it's something underlying all that we see, including water. It's not something we see, but it must be there, and it's so nebulous and so indefinite that it only shows up as something else, right? And so, of course, that creates a really strong cleavage between appearance and reality. Okay, so that's a pretty deep metaphysical view. So Anaximander is the first person that we're aware of to make this sort of theoretical posit of something that can't be seen but accounts for the things that we can see, right? He posits this specific thing, the aporon, that he says we can't really encounter. Okay, so that's interesting. We can see how Anaximander is trying to improve on Thales' view. Maybe we like it, maybe we don't, but there seems to be maybe some progress here. And then Anaximander had a student named Anaximenes, and we don't even have specific dates for him. We just say, well, he lived in the 6th century BCE, which is the 500s to be clear, right? And he held that everything is air and comes from air. So again, I didn't, obviously that sounds like A-I-R, air, and there is a similarity, but I didn't translate it again because, well, he is Anaximander's student. He likes this idea that the ultimate substance or the most basic substance is, a little bit indeterminate and unstable and doesn't tend to appear as itself. Right, so it's not this air around us, but air is some kind of thick vapor, right? If you go somewhere, like if you go to a steam room, it's something like that, like the air the air in a steam room. Okay, so it's this thick vapor, and I think I think Anaximenes must have been going for something in the middle, like in other words, the Greeks. Okay, so the Greeks thought, when they thought about the elements, they thought earth is the most dense, and then water, which is lighter than earth, and then air, which is lighter than water, and then fire. They thought of fire as a substance, as I mentioned already. Okay, now if you say air is a thick vapor, then it's between water and regular air, right? So it's in the middle. So that would seem to be why Anaximenes picked it, right? So he had this interesting view that the mechanism by which air becomes other things is either condensation, it becomes more dense. So here's this vapor, it becomes more dense, now it's water. It becomes more dense, now it's earth. From my point of view, it becomes more dense, now it's like iron, maybe, right? You could keep going. And come back to the vapor here, it becomes less dense. That's rarefaction, is what we call it. Becomes less dense. Now it's this air that we're in, the regular air that we usually experience, and it rarefies again or becomes less dense again, and now it's fire, right? And why did the Greeks think that fire was the least dense or the lightest substance? Because flames flicker upward, right? Just like if you put air underwater, like you could take a cup and just stick it in the water and then turn it right side up, right? You put it upside down, put it in the water, it's kind of holding air, and then turn it right side up again, and it releases the air, and the air goes up, right? So the air is less dense than the water. We know from how it's behaving there. And then flames flicker upward, as I said, so then the Greeks thought, oh, this substance, fire, is the lightest of the substances. It's lighter than air, it goes upward even in the open air. Okay? So that's the Milesian school. Interesting, I hope. And you can see why someone might say of them, they studied things in the sky and below the earth, right? They're into the metaphysics. They're interested in what holds the universe together, right? Okay, and I'm not going to say much about Heraclitus, but I'm trying to make it clear, like, of course the Milesians are just some of the pre-Socratic philosophers, and I figured, you might have actually heard of Heraclitus. So he's known for the doctrine of flux. He's known for the idea that everything is in flux and is changing all the time. He's less well known for his point that those changes are regulated. We can understand the changes because they're governed by the logos. Logos means mind or account. So Heraclitus is a very important Presocratic and very, very important influence on Plato. I mean, Plato was apparently influenced in two different important ways by Heraclitus, and does mention Heraclitus by name in case you're curious. Um, he does agree with Heraclitus that the empirical world, the world of experience, is constantly changing, and that makes it sort of unreliable. So it's an unreliable source of knowledge because it's in flux and it's changing all the time, right? So as point number 2 here says, Heraclitus is remembered for saying, no man steps in the same river twice, right? Because the water is constantly flowing. It's a different river at each moment. That's certainly one way to look at it. But again, that's one influence on Plato, or one way that Heraclitus influenced Plato. But also Plato was influenced by this other idea that, well, it's a different river each moment, but on the other hand, we understand what it's doing. We could give an account of the river, right? And so that is what logos is. That's one of its meanings, is account, right? So what's happening with the water and the way that it flows is regulated somehow. There's some kind of rational pattern that we can grasp, right? That tells us why the water is flowing like it is. And that also had a strong impact on Plato. As you'll see, I'm not going to unpack that right now, but I believe you'll see when we talk about the forms, Platonic forms later, you'll see that that's an important influence on Plato. Okay, and then there were the Sophists, who flourished in the mid-5th century BCE. These aren't pre-Socratics anymore. These are people who were contemporary with Socrates, right? They lived around the same time. So there was the early accusation that Socrates studied things in the sky and below the earth, and I've associated that with the pre-Socratics such as Heraclitus and the whole Milesian school. But then there was the other early accusation that Socrates makes the weak argument the stronger, and if you're wondering where did that come from, why would you say something like that, and who would you say it about? It's the Sophists, who were also called philosophers. So the Athenians probably had some trouble telling Socrates apart from the Sophists. They probably seemed kind of the same to the run-of-the-mill Athenian, okay? But these were professional teachers who emphasized rhetoric and practical knowledge. Rhetoric is speaking, right? So I already mentioned there was this informal education system. Wealthy Athenians wanted to hire these Sophists to teach their young. The Sophists tended to be itinerant teachers, meaning they traveled around. Right, so Protagoras and Gorgias are not from Athens, but they spent a lot of time in Athens. Right, so Protagoras is from Thrace, which is north of Athens. We don't need to get into that. And Gorgias is from Sicily. Okay, and Sicily is an island off the coast of Italy. Again, the Greeks were around the Mediterranean. They were colonizing it. So these were ethnically Greek people, but they're from different parts of the Mediterranean world, we could say. Okay, so Protagoras is a pretty well-remembered sophist. He lived from 490 to 420 BCE. He claimed that man is the measure of all things, of things that are, that they are, of things that are not, that they are not. What does that mean? It's a position of relativism, right? Things are true in relation to us, right? And especially in relation to what we say. So we sort of create or constitute the truth, right? That's not Socrates' view. That seems to be something a lot of sophists believed, but if you're looking for distinctions that the Athenians might have picked up on and didn't, Socrates thinks the point of speech is, you can tell if you read enough Plato, the point of speech is to state the truth as it already exists prior to speech, right? The truth is independent of what we say. The job of speaking is to match what's already true. That is not the view of Protagoras, who thinks we're bringing the truth into being with our speech. And that is the point of saying something like, man is the measure of all things. We make the truth be with our speech. That's the sort of thing Protagoras is saying. You can imagine why someone teaching rhetoric would espouse that view. Man is the measure of all things. That's a way of plugging rhetoric and saying, look at how powerful rhetoric is. I can create reality. I can teach you how to create reality by teaching you rhetoric, right? Okay, so the connection to rhetoric makes sense here, right? Man is the measure of all things. The connection of that to rhetoric, I think is clear. I've tried to speak to it. Gorgias lived from 485 to 380 BCE. Yeah, that's not a typo, right? He seems to have lived a good long life. So good for him. Okay, and again, a rhetorician focused on the power of speech, very careful with words, not so concerned with the truth as Socrates was. Sometimes people called Gorgias the nihilist, right? A nihilist, that word suggests you believe in nothing. Why would they call him the nihilist? Well, he was known to argue for these three claims on the slide. He would try to argue that nothing exists, right? I imagine this was put forward as a sort of challenge, like, I say nothing exists. Try to prove to me that something exists, and I will defeat you, and then I'll show what a great rhetorician I am, right? Okay, so nothing exists, and then he had a sort of back up point. If the other person was persuasive enough, he might retreat to his backup point. Well, even if something exists, we can't think about it, right? Because thinking is just what? Our impressions, right? Our fantasies. We have no idea whether it matches anything in the world. And then he had another backup point in case, again, his opponent was really persuasive. Well, even if we can think about it, maybe our senses emit information into our consciousness from the world, and maybe we could think about something that comes in from the world. But we can't talk about it because you have your mind and I have my mind, and we can't really match the contents of our minds, and so we have no idea what we're talking about. We have no idea whether we're talking about the same thing, so we have no idea whether we're talking about reality, right? So nothing really exists, and even if it does, we can't think about it, and even if we can think about it privately and individually, we can't talk about it, so there's no possibility of shared agreement and shared reference and shared discussion. And so notice that is related to Protagoras' view. That means that our speech isn't constrained by an independent reality, right? So if I could convince you of something, then it might as well be true, because that's the only kind of agreement we're going to get, right? Even if something exists, we cannot talk about it together. So all we could do is agree. So I could coerce you sort of into agreement with the power of my speech, right? So truth seeking is replaced with a kind of violence in which I can sort of make you submit to my will with my rhetorical eloquence, right? So again, this is a great plug for rhetoric. It's basically suggesting that rhetoric creates reality, so you should pay me to teach you rhetoric. I don't think I've even mentioned yet that these teachers tended to get paid, right? So that becomes an important point for Socrates that he likes to repeat. He never got paid for talking to people. So then it wasn't teaching, was it? He never got paid to profess anything, right? The Sophists did demand large sums of money, as is mentioned in the Apology, right? So it's important for Socrates to distance himself from all of that by continually pointing out how poor he is. Okay, so we don't need to touch on all of this here. I will point out under intellectual legacy that there's this problem called the Socrates problem, right? And the problem is, well, Socrates didn't write anything down. So Plato wrote about Socrates, and Xenophon, who we're not going to cover in this course, famously wrote about Socrates, and some other people did as well, and we have like fragments from them. So we have full writings from Plato and Xenophon, and we have fragments from other people. And yeah, I mean, they're not all the same. They don't all give you the same picture of Socrates. Xenophon makes Socrates sound like he's really interested in farming. Plato makes Socrates sound like he's really interested in argumentation, but he likes to use metaphors that he draws from farming. So are they both true? Are they emphasizing different aspects of the same person? You know, they both portray him as interested in virtue and known for his virtue. But yeah, there are these important differences, and we don't know how to square it all. I mean, it's similar to what we see with the Gospels in the New Testament, right? So we've got these different images of Jesus, and yeah, I mean, they're different. So is one of them more true than the other, or how do we reconcile all of them? It's just an issue, and we don't know how to solve it, so I'm just pointing it out. Okay, so touching on Socrates, the man, a bit more here. You should see in the Apology what we call the Socratic method, right? So you've probably heard that phrase before, the Socratic method. Well, what is that exactly? Well, there's a lot of questioning. Socrates was a public philosopher. He didn't write things down. He didn't get paid to philosophize. He didn't get paid to teach a philosophy course, like I'm getting paid to teach this course. He just went around questioning people in public, especially in the agora, the marketplace, right? That's a public marketplace in the middle of Athens. It's not mentioned on the slide, but he also would hang out near the Lyceum, and that was a place where the young men would go and wrestle and lift weights and stuff like that. They would basically work out. And so Socrates would talk to them before and after their workouts about philosophy, try to engage them about virtue and happiness and the meaning of life and all that. Right, so there's a lot of questioning. That's part of the Socratic method. And then Socrates would look for inconsistencies and point them out, right? And then that could be productive. So then his interlocutor, the person he's talking to, might change his mind about something to create a more consistent account. That would be the best case scenario. But yeah, this is called the elenchus, right? It's the struggle. Elenchus is like a fight between wrestlers, right? It's a term used in wrestling. The participants are struggling with each other. So yeah, Socrates pointing out inconsistencies and pushing the interlocutor to respond one way or the other, right? That we call that the elenchus. Excuse me. And then, again, this could be constructive because the interlocutor could give up some beliefs and replace them with beliefs more consistent with, more closely held beliefs that the person is more committed to, right? You could give up some and introduce new ones, and then the new ones cohere better with other things that you haven't given up, right? You could end up having more consistent beliefs as a result of the elenchus. Or what we see, especially in the Euthyphro, that's our prime example, although we haven't read it yet. You could end up in a state of aporia or puzzlement, right? In the Euthyphro specifically, Socrates is trying to get Euthyphro to tell him what piety is. But then every time Euthyphro tells him piety is this, Socrates says, oh, but wait a minute, you said that, and this and that don't go together, right? And then Euthyphro will sort of give up on something and introduce a new belief and say, oh, well, I guess piety is this, and it goes round and round. As Socrates and Euthyphro themselves mention, the conversation ends up going round and round, and at the end, they don't know what piety is, right? So yeah, the Socratic method can be destructive. So if you're wondering why Socrates ended up dead, I mean, you shouldn't kill people for being frustrating and making you feel puzzled, but yeah, I think that is what in fact occurred. Okay, and we've probably heard of Socratic irony as well. So that, irony and Socratic irony in particular are complicated. Irony is basically saying the opposite of what you mean, right? So how do we know when someone is being ironic? It's an art, not a science. Sometimes you can tell Socrates is being ironic, but, scholars do argue about where exactly he's being ironic. Some of the obvious instances are when he's overly friendly to someone that he's having an argument with. In the Euthyphro, he keeps calling Euthyphro my friend, my dear friend, but he's, really handing him his head. So that's one of the obvious instances of irony. His claims to ignorance are more complicated. I don't know that they're ironic, but some people point them out as instances of irony. So Socrates, in the Apology specifically, says, I don't know anything worthwhile, but then he's constantly correcting other people. So is this irony in the most literal sense? I mean, I can't know for sure. I tend to think Socrates is sincere, so it's not, to my mind, irony in the most literal sense. And yet, it's almost as if Socrates lived an ironic existence, right? Going around interrogating, questioning, correcting really other people, but also just saying, I don't know, right, when it comes to really important things. But also there's another ironic side to him in that he doesn't know what virtue is or what courage is, but he knows they're important, and he knows that he should stake his life on them, right? I mean, the way he frames his own death is, well, if you want to kill me for interrogating people about virtue, then go ahead, that's on you. So that's how he frames his own death, right? He's really committed to virtue. He shows this immense confidence that we should talk about virtue and we should pursue it. But also, if you ask him what virtue is, he says, I don't know. So that's ironic, right? That's not the most literal meaning of irony, but it's a sort of paradoxical, conflicted existence. I have no idea what I'm talking about. I don't know what virtue is, but I will sacrifice my life for it. I will sacrifice my life as a way to say to the Athenians, hey, virtue is really important. We should talk about it every day. Okay, so there's a lot there when it comes to Socratic irony. I don't know how to sum it up, but keep it in mind, look at the instances, think about what it means to you. Okay, here's some more context for the trial. The Peloponnesian War is really important. That also helps us understand why Socrates was in trouble. So there's the fact that he's working class and aristocratic young men are following him around. That's really crucial to understanding what happened. But also the Peloponnesian War is really crucial. So this was a war between lots of different city-states, actually, on the Greek peninsula, but especially between Athens and Sparta and their allies, right? So there were some proxy wars going on. The allies were dragged in. Athens had its good moments, but Sparta did ultimately win, maybe because Athens was an open society, and so they were vulnerable to the plague, right? So the plague hit them twice when they were fighting Sparta in the Peloponnesian War, and the second time was a real doozy, and it seems to be why they lost ultimately. And to say a bit more about that, there were lots of different issues with regard to why they fought, but it's partly about a way of life and a way of governing. So it's really a democracy, Athens, versus an oligarchy, Sparta, right? And Sparta's got its oligarchic allies, and Athens has its democratic allies, and that's largely what the fight was about. It's a little more complicated, or in some ways it's more simple, because Athens and Sparta were both very powerful and they were bound to clash. But there's a lot to it. I'm not a historian. I can't get into it all. It matters to the figure of Socrates. Some people seem to think he's a closet oligarch. I don't find that clear at all, but it is what some people think. So Sparta won, they installed a puppet government. The puppet government lasted 9 months, and then the Democrats chased the oligarchs out of the city, so the Athenian democracy was restored. Socrates' trial takes place just a few years after the restoration of democracy. And Anytus in particular, you see Miletus, Anytus, and Lycon mentioned here. They're the accusers, right? Anytus in particular was a prominent Democrat who fought on behalf of the democracy. And just one of the issues here is Socrates didn't leave when the puppet government was in power. So Anytus left. Socrates refers to an exile in the Apology. He talks about the Athenians returning from exile. He's talking about prominent democrats coming back after the puppet government fell. So these people had left because they figured the oligarchy was going to kill them. Socrates didn't leave, so then that really bugs Anytus in particular, who thinks, oh, Socrates is happy to be around the oligarchs, right? Socrates is known to criticize Athens. I mean, he criticizes everything, right? So he criticizes Athens sometimes. Sometimes he says nice things about Sparta. I don't really think Socrates was an oligarch per se. But yeah, I mean, he did say some nice things about Sparta here and there. So Anytus sort of has it in for him, right? The Athenians are very upset about the Peloponnesian War, about their loss, and they're looking for someone to blame, right? And so Socrates is convenient. By the way, there was an amnesty declared in Athens once the war was over. Once the oligarchs were chased out, the government declared an amnesty such that people couldn't really be charged with crimes related to the war. So this is a little complicated. Socrates seems to be charged with things that have nothing to do with the Peloponnesian War, but also it's probably because of resentment, about things that happened during the Peloponnesian War, and especially Socrates staying in Athens when the puppet government was installed, right? So the official charges against Socrates are he corrupts the youth, and he believes in these new gods and not the city's gods, right? So those charges don't mention the war, and they can't because of the amnesty, but this probably all has to do with seething resentment, right? And then another thing about Socrates is he had a lot of companions and hangers-on, and he doesn't want to call them students, but certainly a lot of young men followed him around. Okay, so we could say, as the slide does, controversial students. That's begging the question a little, but Socrates went around, comported with Alcibiades and Critias, and this is a problem for Socrates. So Critias is one of the 30. So Critias was part of the puppet government. Socrates was known to have hung out with him here and there. Alcibiades was one of the young men who followed Socrates around. Alcibiades quite famously was accused of desecrating the Herms in 415 BCE. These are statues of Hermes, and they have phalluses on them. And somebody went through just before an expedition to go fight in the Peloponnesian War, right? This was during the Peloponnesian War. Someone went through and broke the phalluses off the Herms, which again are statues of Hermes. So this is sacrilegious. Alcibiades got blamed. I have no idea whether he did it. And then he fled to Sparta. And, this is during a time when Athens and Sparta were at war, so this seemed like this immense act of disloyalty. So he's told, hey, get out of here. He was ostracized, right? They kind of voted him out, but he wasn't in the city when they voted him out, so he was not supposed to come back. Then they made him a general and told him, we need you to do this, but then they didn't like how he handled the war as a general, and so again they voted that he couldn't come back, and it was a mess. So Alcibiades was this very charismatic, very handsome, known for being a handsome guy. And yeah, by the time you get to 399 BCE, the Athenians hated him. He just seemed very disloyal to them. But he was one of the guys, one of the young men who followed Socrates around. So that looks like a problem for Socrates. Okay, so we've actually reached a good stopping point. I thought this might happen. Um, I've talked a lot about the background to the apology. I still haven't really gotten into it and what happens in the apology. So I should stop and end this lecture, right? And so this can be the lecture on background, and then I'll give another lecture in which I talk about the early accusations, where they came from, how Socrates wants to deal with them. There's a story Socrates tells to explain the early accusations and also to defend himself against the early accusations. I will tell that story. I will try to structure the telling of that story as a sort of argument against the early accusations. Okay, so that'll be in the next lecture, and we'll just let this be, again, a lecture on the background, right? Okay, so I'll see you in the next one.